Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this very special episode of Newsflash. Because today, fresh off appearances on Chapo Trap House, The Majority Report, The Young Turks, all that, those great outlets, we have joining us author of We've Got People, From Jesse Jackson to AOC, The End of Big Money and the Rise of a Movement, all about the history of the modern Democratic Party from, as I said, Jesse Jackson to today. Ryan Grimm, also DC Bureau Chief at the Intercept, joining us. Ryan, thank you so much for coming on and giving us your time, even though you're in the lift.
It's my pleasure.
All right, so yeah, I'd like to start off with we've got the people. When I first saw the title of that book on Twitter, I was like, oh, this kind of rings a little bit of a bell because, of course, I have always been a fan of and kind of an admirer of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I understand this was originally from her campaign ad, her very viral campaign ad that she put out on YouTube.
That's right. The climactic line of it, to me, did a great job of distilling down to its essence what the conflict is between the kind of progressive Democrats and the corporate wing of the party. She said, this is a battle of money against people. They've got money, we've got people. And I thought that nailed it right there. So I stole it.
Yeah, that definitely, it's a really good kind of impersonation. That kind of reminded me of the "for the many, not the few" line that they have in Labor. Yeah. And I thought that was, that kind of encapsulates the whole kind of centrist leftist fight, which is really what your book here is all about, from what I understand. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we really kind of know, at least from your book where it starts off, I'm sure there's probably been other similar conflicts before this, but back in the 1980s, you talk about the first real centrist kind of leftist conflict was back in the 1988 with Reverend Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign. And what were the kind of the competing visions from the ostensibly left side of things back then?
Right. So there were kind of two responses that the party made to, or that people within the party suggested that they could make to the rise of Ronald Reagan and this new right. The one party said, let's give people something they actually want. Let's put together a populist, progressive coalition of the working class, black, white, brown, put everyone together, and that's the only way you're going to challenge the kind of rise of capital through the person of Reagan and this new Republican Party. And the alternative said, no, there's actually nothing fundamentally wrong with the Democratic Party. All we needed to do is to raise a little bit more money from major corporations, go to Wall Street, and then spend that money on 30-second television ads and more sophisticated campaigning in ways that we hadn't done before. 1976 really opened up the floodgates of money in politics, and Republicans definitely exploited that in 1980 with a lot of negative television ads. So some Democrats said, well, all we need to do is just match them dollar for dollar. We'll be fine. But of course, that means you can't run a populist progressive message, because that would be in direct conflict with the corporate money you're trying to get. So the only thing you can do then, if you're going to try to appeal to white working class voters, is throw in a couple doses of racism.
That definitely sounds.
That's the course that the centrist wing decided to take.
Yeah, that definitely sounds somewhat familiar, minus really the racism that we see today. But it was interesting to kind of hear that the Jesse Jackson was kind of the rainbow coalition, bringing everyone together and focusing normally or really kind of on economic struggles, kind of very Marx-like idea of just like we have to put racial and kind of ethnic and religious divides aside and focus on really getting economic justice, which I found to be kind of interesting about this campaign. That was interesting to find out about in your book. And so, like, was there any before this? Was there really any opposition to that kind of overarching democratic view of things, that we need to go to we need to go to Wall Street and get as much money from these interests as possible? Or was Jesse Jackson really the first kind of like big leftist figure?
I mean, he was the one that had the most prominent insurgent presidential campaign on that message. And he ran in 84 and 88. So, the move really only came in the early 80s. People talk about, people think about our political structures as just immutable and written in stone, and that this is how they've just always been since Adam and Eve. But that's not right. The coalitions have been shifting, constantly over a couple hundred years, and it was really in the early '80s when they made their move towards Wall Street. Because ironically, at the time, Wall Street was not was the least offensive of the interest groups that they could go to, because it was sleepy bankers at the time. It wasn't the kind of toxic, sophisticated financial products that we think of today. And so, they didn't want to go to the car makers because they represented the auto workers. They didn't want to go to big oil because they represented a lot of enviro groups. And so Wall Street was like, well, they're not really in direct opposition to anybody in particular. So this is kind of safe, clean money. And it has just evolved from there.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting how that kind of turned over time, and really the Democratic Party didn't truly adapt to that. And an interesting thing about this kind of conflict in this 1988 campaign was the real kind of success off the bat that we saw with Jesse Jackson, that a lot of people don't really pay attention to today, or really remember today. They think, oh, really, this kind of leftist ideology came about really with out of nowhere with Bernie Sanders, but no, we do have some kind of a prior instances of that. What was it like really with Jesse Jackson's campaign early on in the primary stages, and how did it kind of go awry?
In '84, he jumped in very last minute, just as kind of a messaging campaign, and he surprised everybody by being able to register several million voters and do fairly well in some primaries, and he ended up picking up a couple million votes by the time the convention came around. And so he figured, well, if I did so well jumping in late without even trying, like, what would happen if we put together a real campaign? And so he did that with some real echoes of Bernie Sanders from 2016 to 2020.
Yeah.
And so he got in with a full staff, ran a national campaign, and it took off. And after 36 primaries and caucuses, he was neck and neck with Michael Dukakis for the nomination. So there was a moment there where he was a very, very plausible contender.
And what was kind of the reaction from the people who really wanted to go to Wall Street and were really, I'm assuming, kind of profiting off of this kind of system that was already in place, where they're able to get a lot of donations, get up and tight with the big kind of money and interest in Wall Street? What was their reaction to his campaign?
The reaction was apocalyptic. Just warnings that if you nominate Jesse Jackson, that the party, as you know it, is going to be completely wiped off the face of the earth. And Jackson at the time didn't have the ability to translate the energy that was surging into small dollar campaign contributions the way that Bernie Sanders can now. 4 years later, Jerry Brown tried to, recently the California governor, at the time a progressive, tried to run a similar campaign to Jackson, and his innovation was at all of his speeches, he would mention his 800 number, and he wouldn't take more than $100 from any single donor, and so that was his version of trying to get small internet money before the internet.
Well, that's interesting.
But Jackson didn't have any of that, and so he wasn't able to kind of get that bump that you could get nowadays.
Yeah, there's definitely no kind of act blue that we saw back then in the 1980s. Yeah, right. That's interesting because there's so many different things, like disadvantages that he had with kind of the reaction of the Democratic Party and all that. And I mean, Bernie's idea seemed crazy when it was first announced. I can only imagine how Jesse Jackson coming out saying stuff that probably could have been even to the left, maybe, of Bernie Sanders, arguably, back in the 1980s would have seemed coming from an African-American man at the time like that. Do you think if he was allowed to kind of continue uninterrupted, would his campaign have been successful in 1988 America?
In the general election?
Yeah.
George H.W. Bush was a very unpopular vice president. Who knows? It's very easy to say absolutely not. But people didn't think that Obama could be elected in 2008 before he was. If you polled people in 2006, is the country going to elect a black president in 2008, you would have had like 1% just accidentally saying yes. So people can't imagine things until they actually happen. And so maybe it would have been possible. Maybe he could have registered enough voters um, and made it happen. But if not, he still reorients the country toward that, or the party toward that idea that the object of politics is to try to improve the lives of people rather than just to try to hold on to some modicum of power for a political party.
Yeah, that's definitely kind of a perspective on politics, in my opinion, that really has been somewhat missing, at least in the 1990s and kind of after Jesse Jackson kind of went away a little bit. And I mean, after Jesse Jackson obviously was unsuccessful. Like what we know that Bill Clinton came along, and how did the Democratic Party change in terms of like who was elected? What were they like pushing, and what was the position? So what was like the state of left in the 1990s?
They internalized the idea that that we all live in a conservative country, and that if Democrats are going to win any elections anywhere, they're going to have to anywhere other than San Francisco, they're going to have to pretend that they're almost as conservative as the Republicans, but just not quite. And so that's what the Clinton years really offered. And so they would try to go to the right of Republicans on some issues, which they called triangulation, but is really just being right wing, as a way to show their toughness.
Yeah, I do remember that kind of a third way option under Bill Clinton taking shape, and what I've read about that. But it's definitely kind of a crazy time to think about, where being a liberal was almost kind of just like scorned at, like, what, you're a liberal? You're crazy. But like that was definitely a kind of very interesting time, and something that I saw in one of your interviews about this subject, was kind of saying that about Democratic primary voters, they have this kind of thing where we have to focus on being a Republican, and who the media tells me, like we heard back in 1990, internalized the notion that America is a conservative country, that it has to be the most conservative candidate because that's the one who would be elected. That's what the media tells me. And I thought it very interesting that Jesse Jackson was everyone said about him he would never be elected. He was too conservative. They said that about Bernie. Said that even about Howard Dean, which I do want to get to in a little bit. But like, how do you think is the most effective way to kind of like break that mold of previous like misconceptions?
Well, the two ways. One, you've got to demonstrate. You got to convince people. You're not going to convince them that electability doesn't matter. So what you have to do is convince them that their notions of what is electable are wrong. You can ask them, did you think Donald Trump was electable? Anybody who lived through 2016 shouldn't really be talking with much confidence about what could happen in the future, because very few people, predicted that could happen. In fact, Hillary Clinton was giddy when Trump won the nomination because she assumed that she was just going to coast into the White House. And then you have to say, okay, well, if your assumptions are wrong, let's look at your track record. You thought Dukakis was electable. You thought Mondale was. You thought Kerry was. You thought Gore was. You were wrong. The one time that the Democrats nominated somebody who the pundits said couldn't be elected was Barack Hussein Obama. And he was the first Democrat to get more than 50% of the vote in presidential elections since the 1970s. So maybe learn that lesson instead of thinking with fear, thinking it through with So and then the other thing would be, well, let's look at some particular people like Joe Biden. Is he electable? Well, he ran in 1988. He got hammered because he's a terrible candidate then when he was young and still had his mind together. 2008, he ran again. Again, finished with 1%, and now, he's gotten back in for a third time, and he just keeps flipping his positions. And his campaign says that his strategy is to not campaign so that people don't see him. Like, that does not speak of somebody with a lot of confidence. So that's the, I think, approach you got to take, rather than trying to say, well, Joe Biden's wrong on the issues, because most people already agree that he's wrong. They just think that it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's interesting. Unless they kind of want to be like, I feel like they also there's the element of